Councilmember Harris. Okay, we'll move on. Councilmember Nguyen. Councilmember Nusma.
Here.
Councilmember Burns. Councilmember Suffredin. Councilmember Ravel. Councilmember Reed.
Here.
Councilmember Harakaris.
Here.
Councilmember Mayor Biss.
Here.
Councilmember Kelly.
Here.
Councilmember Harris.
Present.
Quorum being present in the room, this meeting will continue with public comment. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, what did I say, 9 people signed up for public comment. Public comment will be limited to 2 minutes per person. We will start with people in the room. First up is Evie Russell, followed by Mary Rosinski, and then Jean Breslin.
Hello.
Ms. Russell.
One moment. The city code needs to be amended to match existing practice. That is, keep the P&D meeting between the Land Use Commission and the council proceedings. We residents do not want to have less chances to speak out and be heard because, in fact, we need more. At Alderman Revel's July community gathering, Chair Rogers encouraged residents to submit comments in writing rather than for us to speak en masse at the commission. But in 2019, staff did not place documents and comments submitted in advance for the commission in the main packet and instead buried them in a side attachment. Members of city committees did not even read this attachment. The information that we residents painstakingly prepared in advance in 2019. Thus, our only options to be heard are multiple city meetings. Abolishing the P&D steps, and worse, the council step is abolishing our democratic right to be heard. Ruggie's proposal to abolish steps is a way to allow big corporations like NU to steamroll residents' rights. Thank you.
Point of order.
Thank you.
Just point of information.
Councilmember
I
Reed.
just want to note that because a staff member is the author of a memo does not mean it's their proposal. I think that's the case. So just to be clear, it's not Ruggie's proposal. It's Ruggie's memo because she's staff.
All right, Mary Rosinski, followed by Jean Breslin, followed by Paul Breslin.
Hi, my name is Mary Rosinski. I live at 1729 Chancellor. I also want to speak to D1. To your point, Alderman Reed, I'm wondering where this originated because I thought back in September 2022 we had a vote of all you that said you would that any policy changes would have to be sponsored by 2 alder people, and this seems to be coming out of left field from staff for no reason, especially in the light that we are in the process. We just paid we're paying $750,000 to revise our comprehensive plan and our zoning. So this seems like something you just should put in the file and just wait on. But I have to say, it also feels like we are just greasing the tracks for developers to come in and have their lane to staff discussions and all this, and the residents are getting a 1 lane, and then we may have 1 off-ramp to talk and another off-ramp at city council. But the problem is that there's no discussion anywhere. I mean, I just looked at the housing committee meeting for tomorrow, and that committee meeting's been reduced to 15 minutes. And this meeting's now reduced to 20 minutes. And when this was all our public comment time has been reduced so much, and we're not having discussions with the people. If we, though, follow our rules, and if we follow our planning code, people won't show up because they will know that we're following it. It's all these people are showing up on different issues because we keep taking the zoning code and we keep taking our comprehensive plan and we put it aside and we sit on it. And then we introduce other things that allow people that have, I won't even go any further on that one, but it's
15
really a
seconds.
violation of due process. So I think that one of the things we have to do is find out what cities are emulating this sort of process. I service, in a lot of different communities. I go to other community meetings, and they don't have as much problem. See,
Thank you very much.
This is like, what happened to 3 minutes? That's really obnoxious. I'm just, I just have to tell you.
Next up
when
is Jean
Haggerty
Breslin,
said-
followed by Paul Breslin, and then David Melton.
Okay, but I just want to know that the Rules Committee, when Mayor Haggerty reduced time at the city council.
Thank you very
he
much.
said-
Next
I'm
up,
going to
please.
say this, Jonathan. I wish you would just see, this is why we can't go with this proposal. Because the fact is, the history is, Mayor
We're following
Haggerty
the
said
rules
that we.
as
but you
they are
made the rules,
currently
and you as
stated.
the
So I'm going
chair
to
have
ask
the
for Jean
opportunity.
Breslin, followed by Paul Breslin, please.
I ask you to keep the current process in place so that enormous developments have adequate review and public input. Huge developments dramatically affect downtown Evanston and Evanston neighborhoods. Council members and the mayor who are elected by voters must have accountability and oversight, not solely the LUC members who are appointed by the mayor. I have a question. Is this meeting going to be available after the fact, either by sound recording or a video recording? Is that correct? This just looks like an end run, and I'm really disappointed. This is not what I thought about the city of Evanston. And I've been an Evanston resident for 45 years. All I can say is shame on you if this is what it looks like.
Thank you. Next up is Paul Breslin, followed by David Melton, and then Ray Friedman.
I have to say, it looks to me as if the rules are being reverse engineered to produce a desired result. That's what it looks like from out here. The city wants more revenue, the city wants more development. So whatever has to be done to the rules to get that to happen, the city will do. I agree with two of the previous speakers that consigning the whole process to a committee appointed by the mayor and with no input from our elected council members is not acceptable. I was told by Mr. Cummings that the one proposal that had been voted down 5-4 in the LUC, voted down 5-1 in planning and development, and had been proposed and not received a second in council, was still alive because of provision in Section 41 of Robert's Rules of Order. I have spent the last 4 days doing a deep dive into the 12th edition of Robert's Rules of Order and have discovered that, in fact, a number of things that are in that book simply were not followed in the June 26th meeting. I watched the video of the relevant portion of that meeting, and I am going to distribute to all of you and to Mr. Cummings and to the Planning Department the document in which I have made this argument. I say, if the city needs money, tell us how much money you have. We don't even know that. As a citizen, I want to know that. And is it really worth doing this to get it?
You. David Melton, followed by Ray Friedman, and then we will go to online comment.
My name is David Melton. I reside at 404 Greenwood. I'm a 38-year resident of Evanston. I am also co-chair of Reform for Illinois. I rise to address a different issue than the prior speakers. I rise to address the adoption of Ordinance 56-0-23, adding Title I, Chapter 13, Section 5, Small Donor Matching System for Fair Elections, which is on the agenda as item R2. I want to speak in favor of this. I would point out that small donor matching ordinances have been adopted in 14 other states and 25 other municipalities in the United States. Currently, Illinois does not have any municipality or unit of government that has adopted this, but this is a good proposal to try and counteract the influence of big money in elections. So I rise in support of it. I am here along with our executive director from Reform for Illinois, Ms. Kaplan, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have about that.
Thank you. Ray Friedman will be our last in-person commenter unless there's somebody else who was unable to sign up. All right, we'll get you after Ray.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think we need to get back to basics. And once again, I'd like to make a couple of comments about public comment. I thought public comment was designed for the public and intended to create a dialogue in some way, shape, or form. Not tonight, but at some point in time. Once again, I ask that you, or how you, intend to make that happen, because that's what's intended by public comment. There should be a rule that requires that dialogue. Okay, Rules Committee is a good place to start. How do you intend to make that happen? Do you really want input from the public? Or is it just something that's required by law? And why do you only allow 2 minutes for public comment for Rules Committee and 3 minutes at council? Only 20 minutes total public comment here at Rules Committee and 45 minutes at City Council. Is this not as important as City Council meetings? Why are those public comment minutes so drastically different? Residents need to be part of all the discussions and all the processes. By the way, last council meeting 1 week ago, Mayor Biss gave residents about 1:40 for public comment. There were only 11 speakers in person and 7 on the phone. Obviously, the public comment process is not working as it was designed to. How do you plan to correct the disregard for your residents? This is Rules Committee. Obviously, we need some new rules for
15
public
seconds.
comment. You're way, way, way off, okay? When there's only 18 speakers at public comment at City Council meeting, and you're giving 1:40 for each, you're way off with the time. This is just totally
Thank you.
wrong. You're abusing your process here.
Thank you,
okay?
Mr.
You
Friedman.
need to make it count for something.
And next, we will go to this gentleman, and then we will go to online, and we have Mike Vasilko, Jim Hughes, and Jeff Smith
Mayor Biss,
signed up for online. If you could state your name, please.
my name is Jim Hughes,
You are,
2518
okay.
Hartselle.
We had you for the online,
You
but you're
did.
in person, so
Right.
go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was working in the garden, put on a clean shirt for Zoom, and couldn't get through, so I drove over here. My apologies. Hey, thank you for the opportunity to comment on Agenda Item D1 regarding the process for Land Use Commission recommendations. The 717 memo from legal staff outlining 3 options for this process states that, under the city code, there is no direction to send these items to the Planning Development Committee. I read the city code, and there is such reference in sections 219.1, the purpose of the LUC, and in section 219.4 regarding LUC powers and duties. Generally, statements such as, hear and make recommendations to the Planning and Development Committee and the City Council. Both these sections appear consistent with the original ordinance establishing the LUC, Ordinance 92-021. So I'm confused. From my reading, the need to change the code is an inaccurate premise. I would also like to suggest that the council keep the current process as clearly outlined in the code currently, and seek more input from the public before considering removing zoning decisions from our 9 elected officials, and instead solely tasking 9 appointed residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to online comment with Mike Vasilko, followed by Jeff Smith. 2 minutes each. You can't see the timer, so I will give you a 15-second warning. Mr. Vasilko?
Thank you. Pretty much like everybody else who has spoken.
I'm sorry, we're having an audio issue here. I'm not sure if it's your microphone or our audio here. Mike, can you, Mr. Vasilko, can you give us a mic check, please?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, it's on our end. Don't worry, this doesn't count towards your time.
Just to confirm that it's
Okay.
not Mr. Vasilko, is there someone else that can?
We should, I just got a thumbs up, so Mr. Vasilko, if you could go ahead, please, I'll let you know if we can't hear you.
Thank you. Pretty much.
No,
like
we still
everybody else.
can't. Let's come back to Mr. Vasilko, and we'll go with Jeff Smith. We'll see if Mr. Smith's microphone is working. Apologies, our IT staff looks like they're on it. But Jeff Smith, are you on the Zoom?
I'm on the Zoom. Have you checked to see that you're not picking up?
We can
audio
hear
on
you,
the
but
mic on the
not
podium
very
and
well
getting
either.
feedback?
There we go. Okay, looks like we have our audio issues in order. So let's go back to our original order, Mr. Vasilko, followed by Mr. Smith.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. The clock is ticking.
Thank you. Pretty much like everybody else before me, I'm speaking on D1 and against voting in favor of D1, so I'm asking you to vote against it. You know, I guess I'm a skeptical person because it seems that the timing of this is so coincidental with Northwestern's Ryan Field proposal coming down the pike. Seems like if this is approved, I know this is supposed to be for discussion, but if it gets to the point where it's approved and the timing is such that Northwestern can take advantage of it, they will, or they will try to. This has their fingerprints all over it, in my opinion, and I'd hate to think they have some way of influencing what's going on with staff making this recommendation. So I'm asking you to vote against it. I'd also like to know the status of the city financed Ryan Field Development Economic Impact Study. That's been out there for months, supposedly being worked on. I haven't seen any public meetings being noted in the calendar. Citizen comments have not been involved in that process, to the best of my knowledge. And I hope that that document, in whatever form it is not going to be released on the eve of the LUC meeting on August 9th. So tonight, please don't even bring this D1 issue up for discussion.
15
Thank you.
seconds.
I'm done.
Thank you, Mr. Vasilko, and apologies for the false start with the microphone. Mr. Smith, over to you, sir.
Unmuting now. Thank you, Chairman Newsma and members of the committee. I'm here tonight on D1 because zoning decisions have a constitutional dimension. People make consequential financial and life decisions based on what can be done there with their property and nearby properties. Buying, selling, or rehabbing a home or business is not as simple as changing brands of toothpaste. So zoning and zoning changes, which aren't powers inherent to municipalities but are granted by state of Illinois statute, are required to afford due process to those with property interests at stake. Otherwise, it can be an unconstitutional taking. There are pros and cons to multiple levels of process and process before elected and political bodies versus unelected and unaccountable bodies. You'd expect a memo on a topic this momentous to discuss constitutionality, due process, transparency, and at bottom, what's fairest for the parties affected and what will result in the best decision-making on behalf of the residents of Evanston who the council, mayor, and boards and commissions serve. Instead, the report to this committee dismayingly focuses only on issues of convenience like hard start times and making a better record for when the city gets sued. We've already had too much truncation of resident rights and due process, such as setting arbitrary cumulative comment limits or dissolving the ZBA. There are procedural options beyond those in the memo. As CSNA recommends, no new option should be chosen, especially option 2, until this committee has been adequately briefed on and had the fuller discussion that this truly important topic deserves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. That brings us to the end of public comment. One last call for anybody in the room or anybody online. Seeing none, we will move on with the agenda. Next up is the approval of the Rules Committee meeting minutes from June 5th of this year.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Reed, seconded by Councilmember Nguyen. I'm going to ask for a roll call vote.
Councilmember Harris.
Councilmember Harris, you're muted.
We'll come back. Councilmember Nguyen. Councilmember Nusma.
Aye.
Councilmember Reed.
Aye.
Councilmember Harakaris.
Aye.
Mayor Biss. Councilmember Kelly.
Aye.
Councilmember Harris.
We're not picking up Councilmember Harris, so by a vote of 6-0, the minutes from June 5th are approved, which brings us to item R1. This is Resolution 4R23, amending City Council Rule 1 to add Rule 1.3 regarding adjournment. If somebody could make a motion on this?
I'll move item R1.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Kelly, seconded by Councilmember Reed. Is there any discussion? Seeing none from other members of the committee until Councilmember Reed requested to be recognized, which I will do now.
I just wanted to check. We didn't get to check on this. So do you believe this accomplishes what you set out to accomplish?
Yeah, I think the amended, I support the way it's been amended so that should there be a council member serving another term, any item that had been previously referred could jump back right up to a standing committee. So I think it's hopefully amended to everybody's, yes. So yes, it does. Thank you for asking.
I don't, thank
I
you.
believe she's referring to the amendment comparing what's in our packet to what we previously talked about, not to a suggested amendment I'm about to make that just kind of clarifies a few things, if that was your
Okay.
question.
Well, then I will stop until that suggested amendment is made.
All right. Yeah, I'm in support. I just am offering an amendment that clarifies a couple of things. One was a missing word. So I'm suggesting that we add the word action. So any other matter that has not been resolved through a final city council action, it seemed that word was missing. And I want to explicitly state that a referral is one of the matters that that would have to be re-referred. We didn't explicitly say referral, so I am suggesting we add that. So I've emailed the revised wording, or my proposed wording just a few minutes ago. So I will make a motion to make those minor amendments.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Nusma, seconded by Councilmember Reed. Is there any discussion on this amendment? Seeing none, I'll call for a roll on this amendment.
Councilmember Harris.
Aye.
Councilmember Nguyen. Councilmember Nusma.
Aye.
Councilmember Reed.
Aye.
Councilmember Harakaris.
Aye.
Mayor Biss. Councilmember Kelly.
Aye.
By a vote of 7-0, the amendment is passed, which brings us to discussion on the underlying motion. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I will ask for a roll call vote on the underlying motion.
Councilmember Harris.
Aye.
Councilmember Nguyen. Councilmember Nusma.
Aye.
Councilmember Reed.
Aye.
Councilmember Harakaris.
Aye.
Mayor Biss. Councilmember Kelly.
Aye.
By a vote of 7-0, Resolution 4R23 as amended passes, which brings us to item R2. If somebody would care to make a motion on R2.
I move R2.
Second.
It's been properly moved by Councilmember Hadakatis and seconded by Mayor Biss. This is ordinance 56023, adding Title I, Chapter 13, Section 5, Small Donor Matching System for Fair Elections. Is there any discussion? Councilmember Hadakatis, followed by Councilmember Reed.
So I'll just speak a little bit to this. When I worked with Reform for Illinois to come up with this ordinance, I think, my thought is that, your elections and money, not a great mix. I think there is a desire for campaign finance reform. This will allow folks running for mayor to use public funds to finance their campaign. This is something that will add a level of transparency to our local politics. This is something that is costs less than $1 per person per year. It's $68,000 to start the fund. It is, I think, important that we establish, if we're going to do this, establish a fund this year. I'd urge my colleagues to vote this forward. There are some, if we're looking at amendments, I think we have a month break from City Council. I would urge people to, come forward with any changes. But I feel if you are in favor of this as a general idea, we should move this forward to council, and we can work out the small details going forward.
Councilmember Reed.
Thank you. I highly appreciate Councilmember Hadakatis for leading on this issue. It is extremely important that we get big money out of, and at the municipal level, big money means something different, but big money out of our local politics. And make sure that our democracy is accessible to as many folks as possible. And so I certainly agree with the mission here. And I'm willing to, my main concern here is that I don't know if this particular reform helps us reach folks who are low propensity voters, as well as some other policies such as democracy dollars might. We have seen that democracy dollars in Seattle, I believe, have increased voter participation amongst low propensity voters. I have not seen research that shows that the small donor matching system accomplishes the same outset. And one of the unintended consequences that I fear is that we will increase the power, the financial power to contribute to campaigns of folks who already are likely to vote and contribute. And instead of someone having to donate as much as they would have in the past, we're in some ways subsidizing folks who are likely to contribute. So, I would love to see us move forward with a program that uses a voucher-based system. If we do not move forward with a voucher-based system, I would ask that we limit the matching contribution eligibility to folks who are in some lower income bracket. One, that'll save some money, but two, it will encourage candidates to reach out to those lower propensity voters and get them to vote and turn out in our municipal elections. And so I think that we have to build in an incentive here to reach beyond the normal contributors, beyond the normal voters who show up. And so I don't quite have an amendment yet that is formulated, but I would, if folks are open to some form of limiting this program in a way that helps us target low propensity voters better, I'm willing to move forward with this, although I'd much prefer a voucher-based program, which I think would have a much greater impact on increasing voter participation. And, quite frankly, this initiative big money in local campaigns is a $1,000 contribution. Essentially, some of us may receive occasionally a $5,000 contribution, but quite frankly, even a $500 contribution in municipal elections is big money in our races, particularly in the aldermanic races. I know this is for the mayoral campaign, but I think if we did an analysis across the board for the mayoral race, it's a much smaller dollar amount that we're talking about here. So I'll hold my thoughts there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Biss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask, because one of the benefits of this approach is that it has been in operation relatively recently in an awful lot of places and for quite a long time in a few places. And I was wondering if the folks from Reform for Illinois could just speak quickly to what we've learned from the execution of this type of matching program.
My printer is broken, so I'm reading from my phone, so I apologize for that awkwardness. There's actually significant research on how small donor matching programs increase donations from low propensity voters or low propensity donors. Much, much more data than there is for voucher programs, because voucher programs have only been in place since 2017 in Seattle. So we only have a couple elections where we can even draw any conclusions. In New York City has been studied extensively. They've had a program since the 1980s. And the Brennan Center, which studies these issues in depth, found that their small donor matching, New York small donor matching program, could increase the amount of donations in minority areas by up to 24 times. We've had more recent programs in Washington, D.C. They found that the zip code with the most contributions had one of the lowest median incomes in the district and encompassed its most diverse neighborhood. In Portland, Oregon, they found that when they implemented a small donor matching program, the size of the donation shrank by 15 times. Contributors were more evenly spread around the city, and a majority of small donors to city elections under that program had never given before. So we have extensive evidence that small donor matching programs have the kind of effects that I think Alderman Reed is looking for, and certainly that we're looking for as well.
Councilmember Reed.
Thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing that. I do want to note, I've recently been to both of these cities. New York City, Washington, D.C. are very different from Evanston. D.C.'s population is almost 45% African American. They have some of the highest rate of income inequality in our nation. New York City, again, is another city that has a much higher minority population than the city of Evanston, and much higher rates of poverty than the city of Evanston. So I think, in this case, assuming that, this will have that impact here, I can't say that for certain. I would like to see us limit eligibility for matching funds to some income bracket. I don't think that we should be matching funds for folks who can truly afford to give a contribution. I think there should be an incentive, a stronger incentive than there is in New York City or Washington, D.C. or Portland, Oregon. Here in Evanston, a stronger incentive to ensure that candidates are reaching out to low-income, low-propensity voters to work to earn their vote and work to earn a contribution. And so while I certainly would support this being workshopped at some point, I would like to move to limit the eligibility, or create and limit the eligibility to folks who are at 80% of AMI or lower.
Can I speak?
Well, I've made a motion. We'll see if there's a second.
It's Ms. Kaplan.
Unfortunately, that would almost certainly be unconstitutional under existing law.
Can you explain why?
David, would you? Because you can't treat different classes.
Well, income isn't a
Which
protected
the Supreme
class.
Court cases since 2007, when Chief Justice Roberts took the court, have been hostile to campaign finance reform generally. two of the Supreme Court cases address the rights of rich donors. In one case, the court held that a matching system that had been adopted, I believe was in North Carolina, which had a provision for adjusting limits when a non-candidate or a candidate dumped a large amount of money into an election, say an independent PAC or an outside donor. And the Supreme Court held that was unconstitutional as violating the rights of the wealthier contributors under the First Amendment. If I recall the holding of that case correctly, I'd be happy to get the details and provide them, but that's my recollection of that case. There's another case where the court has suggested that differentiating between rich donors and poor donors is questionable as well, because we all have the same basic First Amendment rights, whether you agree with that or not. That is the view of the current majority on the Supreme Court. So that is the basis for suggesting that there may be constitutional issues with an income-based differentiation in the approach.
Thank you. I would love to see those cases and read the holdings in those cases. My understanding of Illinois law is that, for example, if a candidate were to contribute $100,000 to their campaign, it would remove the caps, if you will.
That's under the Illinois statute because that's the only kind of adjustment that the Supreme Court case allows. That's why that provision was adopted as an amendment to the Illinois Campaign Finance Reform Act that was originally adopted in 2009, and that amendment, lifting the limits if there's a large contribution, was the only available remedy under the existing Supreme Court precedent, and it was adopted in 2011.
Thank you. Well, there wasn't a second to that amendment. I trust your judgment there. I would love to read more about it. I think then we need to understand the impact of this, and I think somehow we need to, I am greatly fearful that we are only going to boost the ability of, wealthier, more connected Evanstonians, folks who tend to vote in elections. We're only going to increase their ability to influence our elections even more and subsidize that by taxpayers. I would love to see, I believe Seattle's voucher program, is there an income component to that, or is that universal as well?
Which program?
Seattle's voucher program.
I don't believe there's an income. I do not believe there's an income provision in the Seattle program. It's open to all registered voters, as I recall. And I'd be happy to discuss the Supreme Court cases with you offline. But the other thing I would point out is that any adoption of any campaign finance reform is likely to be challenged by right-wing people who oppose any change in the campaign finance system to make it fairer to the vast majority of citizens where their voices are drowned out by big money. And there was an earlier Brennan Center study several years ago under the New York City ordinance, which, as Ms. Kaplan indicated, showed that it did increase diverse participation in the system, both at a candidate and at a donor level. So that study is also available online.
Thank you. And to close out here, speaking of legality, I don't recall if my question regarding just the legality of the city using taxpayer money to subsidize political campaigns, if that was answered in the memo.
I don't know that we have an answer to that quite yet. I talked to Deputy City Attorney Ruggie earlier today, and I don't know that we have an answer to that. I can just tell you generally there is a prohibition against using public property for private interest, but I don't think that we would consider campaigns or elections to be private interests per se. I think that's probably also public interest.
If I could, our organization has researched this issue as well, and we'd be happy to consult with you on it, but we do not believe it would be illegal under Illinois law.
Okay, I would like us to look into both of those. I really would implore my colleagues, particularly if we find out that there is a way that we can do this, to look into having, limits or additional boosters or whatever we will for low-income folks, or some way that we can build into this ordinance a more intentional mechanism that will encourage candidates to reach out to low propensity voters. If we can do that, I can get 100% behind this. I do still have concerns, and I hope that the legal questions will be answered before we move forward, because I fear that we're going to potentially walk ourselves into another we've already got ranked choice voting coming up, which I have some serious legal concerns about, and maybe challenged in court. And to have two things challenged in court, and not by right-wing folks, by progressive folks who are concerned about making sure that black and brown and low-income and student voters are participating in our local elections at higher rates, because we know that, quite frankly, they are not. And I fear that some of these changes could add to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Reed. And for the record, Councilmember Reed's motion failed for lack of a second. I'm going to share some concerns of my own, and then Councilmember Kelly has sought recognition. I'm generally in favor of this philosophically. I think making democracy more accessible to voters, making democracy more accessible to potential candidates is in the best interests of our city. It's in the best interests of our country. So I like the direction this is going. I do have, looking at the details, a number of questions and things that need to be cleaned up a little bit. Probably too many, and with some fairly broad questions, too much to clean up on the dais tonight to be able to enable me to vote for this tonight. But I will share my three most significant concerns. One is the qualifying period, and if the idea here is to open up the mayoral race to folks who might not ordinarily be interested or able to consider running, I think we should shorten up the qualifying period. As currently drafted, the qualifying period starts the day after the election, after the previous election. So 4+ years, or let's round it to 4 years, for an incumbent mayor to get qualifying donations. A challenger would not normally materialize until the year before the election, 6 months. There's no hard number on that, but I would be in favor of making the qualifying period something less. I'll suggest, at least for further discussion, to make the qualifying period start 6 months before the last day of the filing period for the election in question. So that's just one problem I have. Another issue I have is regarding the role of the city clerk. Not in administering this program. I think it makes sense for the clerk to handle the paperwork, to handle the applications, but to ask the clerk to serve in a quasi-judicial role if there is a dispute is not something I think the clerk's office is set up to do. The clerk doesn't have that training. The clerk doesn't have that experience. And the clerk in and of itself is an elected position. So, to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest, I think a different mechanism to handle disputes or allegations of somebody not following the rules would be appropriate here. Perhaps the answer is our existing election board, which isn't a great answer since that's elected officials too. But so that's I am stumbling on the role of the clerk in that regard. And then another issue that we at the minimum need to clear up is with regards to the draft section 11357. Which is limitations on contributions. We have talked about the definition of a lobbyist, so I'm not sure where we're at with the state definition and how does that play out here locally, if at all. The current draft also suggests that anyone doing business with the city of Evanston more than $5,000 should be prohibited from should be prohibited from donating. if we were to do that, and I certainly understand the intent, I think the onus has to be on the donor to self-certify, because we can't ask a candidate to reasonably know who of the thousand of, to know the 1,000 vendors that the city deals with on an annual basis. That's just, would be unrealistic to expect the candidate to be able to filter that, such a donor out in all cases. Also have, in a similar vein, the prohibition against anyone who is, I don't know the exact words, but who is looking to do a zoning variance with the city. That would preclude me from participating. I applied for a curb cut in 2010 so my pregnant wife wouldn't have to get out of the car on the street, pregnant with twins, by the way. It was denied, no problem, I ran for city council. But I don't think the intent of the ordinance is to preclude folks like me in that case from participating. So we would need to, clean up this language and, make it clear that what we're trying to do is prohibit undue fiscal influence from developers who are seeking to buy influence. That's the point. I get it. That makes sense. But the wording that we have doesn't make that abundantly clear. And again, this, in order for it to be, effective and practically effective, would require the donor to self-certify. Because there's no telling if, who may choose to apply for a variance 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years into a term. And so to hold the candidate responsible for that would just not make sense. So, Ms. Kaplan, it seems like you have some responses here.
Yeah, we actually addressed your concerns. Allison, I didn't know, should we discuss them? Yeah, we actually addressed your concerns in a memo and drafted proposals for modifying the legislation. For the zoning, for example, it specifies that it's non-residential, so you and your wife wouldn't be included. Things like, planning, whether you're doing business or planning to do business, that's just the addition of a word. Moving the qualifying period, we're totally open to and is an easy thing to do. You can just say, you start the qualifying period 6 months before. I think in our proposal, it was the November 1st before the election. What were your other questions?
Those were, the three main ones were the qualifying period, the role of the city clerk, and the donor.
The role of the city clerk, we actually vetted the ordinance with both the city clerk and the corporation council when we first drafted it. And the only objection that came up was that the clerk had originally been tasked with levying fees and fines. And they didn't feel that that was appropriate to her role. So we took that out, and we understand from the clerk, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that she does things like this in the course of her position, so it wouldn't be outlandish to ask her to perform some of these functions.
And my concerns are in no way based on our current city clerk, who I'm sure is perfectly capable.
Totally.
It's just, I'm
It's an
speaking
understandable
generally
question.
for,
Yeah.
future hypothetical city clerks
Was there
here.
something you wanted to add, David?
Just that, we're not familiar with the generally way the city handles administrative hearings, but if there is some other body that could more appropriately handle an administrative hearing in a disciplinary type situation, we certainly are open to using that. Alternatively, we could draft and provide for, create an entirely separate organization to handle those types of administrative proceedings, but that adds a lot of expense and complication that I don't think is warranted here.
Point of information to
Sure.
one of your questions. Does having the qualifying period start after an election, does that then limit a mayor who wants to participate in the program from gathering contributions above the voluntary thresholds?
Yeah, that's a very good question. They would be limited to complying with the restrictions of the ordinance, including large donations or corporate donations or whatever, for the entire election cycle.
And so by shortening that period, we would allow a mayor to have a, a year or 2 year period where they could raise as much money as they want
Well,
and then come.
we have a proposal where they wouldn't be able to raise the money. You can easily put that restriction on and say they can only raise money during the qualifying period. But I should say that, that's something that incumbents can do right now. And so, this would still be lifting everybody up, even if incumbents had that advantage. But if you decided that incumbents shouldn't have that advantage, it's an easy thing to fix.
It would be prohibited under the ordinance because in order to be a participating candidate in the program, you have to certify that for the prior election cycle, you're in compliance with all the requirements of the ordinance, which includes a cap on maximum contributions. So no, your scenario would not be permitted under the current draft, as I understand it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a number of other kind of minor concerns, things that are fairly easy to fix. Don't want to go into that detail right now. I will recognize Councilmember Kelly.
Thank you. So with regard to the role of the clerk here, those responsibilities with the other cities that you've worked on or studied with, how do they handle it? Who handles
It
the
varies
review and-
widely depending on the existing bodies of the other cities. So in some cases, it resides within whatever election authority is. In some cases, in the bigger cities like New York, there's a campaign finance board. So it really just depends on the existing capacity of the jurisdiction at hand. Some of these, we try not to reinvent the wheel as much as possible, but sometimes there are just unique circumstances that we can't, find.
So in
precedent
terms
for.
of who reviews and approves, that's just kind of all over the place right now. There's no
Yeah,
best practice.
It's common, again, in a bigger jurisdiction to have a campaign finance board.
And actually, in the first instance, the clerk is responsible for making sure that participating candidates meet the requirements of the ordinance in order to receive funds.
Okay. Thank you. And we would be the first in Illinois, or?
Yes, to have a program like this.
Thank you.
Council Cummings, were you seeking?
Yes, just briefly to state that the enforcement mechanism in the city with our administrative review process is perfectly fine. I think the concern that was expressed by the law department was the lack of staff to be able to review it in order to bring that enforcement action. Right now, the clerk and 2 deputy clerks, but we don't know exactly what this burden would be in terms of if this is implemented. But that was our concern. It wasn't that we didn't think that the clerk, strike that. We did think that the issue with having the clerk do enforcement was a lack of staff to actually investigate in order to bring in enforcement action.
And the ordinance does provide for additional staff for the clerk during election season to assist with that.
Is there any additional discussion? Councilmember Reed?
Yes. With equity in mind, I think we should move to amend this to include the 2 or 3 wards with the highest rates of poverty, to also allow those candidates who are seeking to run in those wards the ability to use this small donor matching fund system. I think that'll allow that'll help us be intentional about outreach to the wards with the highest rates of poverty. And so, those wards would be the 5th ward, the 2nd ward, the 5th ward, and the 8th ward. And so I will move. I'm happy to discuss this between time, but I think we have to do something to ensure that we are being intentional about equity here. So I'll move that we include the 3 wards, candidates for the 3 wards with the highest rates of poverty in the matching program.
I will remind you that we're talking about only the mayoral race here, not aldermanic races.
Right, which is what my amendment is about, allowing the 3 wards with the candidates for aldermen in the 3 wards to also have access to the small donor matching funds.
Councilmember Reed has made a motion to add aldermanic or council member races to the 3 wards
with the highest rates
with
of
the
poverty.
highest rates of poverty to this ordinance. Is there a second? The motion fails for lack of a second. Because I am concerned about some of these significant issues and, unable to vote in favor of this tonight, I am going to move to table this until our next Rules Committee meeting to work out some of these details.
Second.
It's been moved by myself, seconded by Councilmember Reed. And what is our procedural move here?
There is no discussion on a motion to table, but you can still vote it. I don't know what the next date of the next Rules Committee meeting is. I think it's September. The first Monday in September would not be it because of a holiday, but I think it's really in September.
It's in October.
Okay.
It's unlikely to make it into the budget this year, the initial budget appropriation, if that happens. Just
It's not impossible to make it into the budget if it's the first meeting in October.
All right, so the motion is to table this item until the next Rules Committee meeting, which is going to be the first Monday in October. Councilmember Nguyen?
Thank you. I mean, couldn't we schedule a Rules Committee meeting in early September? Because it's because of the Labor Day holiday that we wouldn't have one on the calendar. So it could be perhaps the third Monday or a Tuesday, although Tuesdays are pretty booked.
Point of information, the motion is just to the next meeting, so the chair can schedule a meeting whenever they want,
Okay,
just the next
right.
meeting.
But I think that we should not wait till the first meeting in October. We should address these concerns before that.
Mr. Mayor?
I mean, I would just respectfully urge a no vote on this motion. This is an ordinance, so if it were to move forward, it would have two different readings at council. I think we just got a memo that addresses the overwhelming majority of the issues that have been raised. I know that this is an item that's been under discussion and advocated by Councilmember Hadakatis since very early in the calendar year. And, I have to say that he was always urging us to move forward, so we had ample time to consider this in time for the budget discussions. And now here we find ourselves in mid-July with a lot of information, a lot of details that have been shared, and a lot of work that's been done. I would say we should move this forward. There'll still be two more opportunities for amendments to be considered. But it seems to me that time is of the essence, and the quality of the item before us more than merits it being forwarded on to council.
Councilmember Reed?
I humbly disagree with our mayor on this. I would encourage us to table this. I don't think that council is the place to iron out as many details as this ordinance requires, although, this is the full body, but we have an opportunity to pay a bit more attention here. I would encourage us to table this until the next meeting, and the chair can work to schedule a meeting in September. I also think that if this comes in mid-October or early October, we don't adopt our budget until November often, and we can put a placeholder in, assuming that this is coming. We know how much is estimated for at least next year. I would encourage us to table this, get it right, make sure that we're crossing all of our T's and dotting all of our I's. And I would, if we aren't going to table this, I unfortunately would have to vote no today. I am concerned about us not being intentional about addressing the equity concerns. We did that with ranked choice voting. I can't have us do that again.
Councilmember Kelly, and then I want to wrap this one up fairly quickly.
Thank you. Councilmember Newsom, I thought you made many good points. Could all of those potentially, would you feel comfortable with those being addressed and brought back to council?
Either way, it's the same 10 people that are going to have the discussion and the same 10 people that are going to do the work. So I think I tend to agree with Councilmember Reed that doing the I dotting and the T crossing at the committee level is the right place to do that work. We do that effectively, then it sails through council by the time it gets to us in that forum. And in light of the necessity of budgeting for this next year, I'm supportive of making sure we set money aside and having that be part of the budgeting process, which is just now getting started. So the motion is on the table to postpone or to table this item to the next meeting of the Rules Committee. That meeting will be scheduled by the chair. The chair is Councilmember Burns. I'm Chair Pro Tem today, so we're not going to set the date right now. But that is the motion on the table. And Council Cummings, we do have to vote on this motion. So
Yes.
if there's no further discussion on this motion, the motion to table has been made and seconded, and I'll ask for a roll.
Councilmember Harris?
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn? Councilmember Nusma?
Aye.
Councilmember Reed?
Aye.
Councilmember Karakaris?
No.
Mayor Biss? Councilmember Kelly?
No.
By a vote of 4-3, that motion fails, which brings us to the underlying motion. And if there's no further discussion, I will call for a roll on the underlying motion.
Right. Councilmember Harris?
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn? Councilmember Nusma?
Aye.
Councilmember Reed?
No.
Councilmember Karakaris?
Aye.
Mayor Biss? Councilmember Kelly?
Aye.
By a vote of 6-1, item R2 passes, which brings us to item R3, ordinance 67023, amending Title II, Chapter 20, Finance and Budget Committee. If I could have a motion?
I move item ordinance 67-0-23.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Kelly, seconded by Councilmember Wynn. Is there any discussion on item R3?
I'll just say I
Councilmember
urge a
Reed?
yes vote. And if folks are planning on voting no, please speak now, and so we can make a case for why you should vote yes.
Seeing no further discussion, I will call for a vote on R3.
Councilmember Harris?
Aye.
Councilmember Wynn? Councilmember Nusma?
Aye.
Councilmember Reed?
Aye.
Councilmember Karakaris?
Aye.
Mayor Biss? Councilmember Kelly?
Aye.
By a vote of 7-0, item R3 passes. Which brings us to item D1. This is for discussion only, I would like to make clear. This is discussion regarding sending special use permit applications, unique use applications, major variation applications, and planned development applications directly to City Council from the Land Use Commission.
So moved.
It's been moved by Councilmember Reed, seconded by Mayor Biss. So the item is now on the table for discussion. I believe Council Cummings had his light on. I'll recognize Council Cummings, then Councilmember Hadakatis, followed by Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Councilmember Newsom. I just wanted to add some, I guess, history for the committee to consider as well, because there were a lot of, obviously this item got a lot of attention with public comment. We also received an email earlier today. So the city has had, like other municipalities, a plan commission as well as a zoning board of appeals. An ordinance was passed in 2021 to create the land use commission, which combined those two entities, because those two entities, we were having trouble as a city filling the positions on those various different boards and oftentimes meeting quorum requirements. This was under the former community development director, Johanna Neiden. came up with this in conjunction with the law department, came with the idea to create a land use commission that combined both of those. The City Code 2-19, if you look at the powers and duties of the Land Use Commission, they mirror the powers and duties of the Plan Commission and the Zoning Board of Appeals. The Plan Commission would send certain particular items through the Planning and Development Committee, and the Zoning Board of Appeals would send certain items to City Council. So in combining those two entities and creating a Land Use Commission, we now have powers and duties for the Land Use Commission to send items to both the Planning and Development Committee as well as City Council. Evanston is somewhat unique, at least in our survey of surrounding communities, in the sense that we have items that go to a specific City Council standing committee. For example, Skokie and Wilmette, our neighboring communities to the north and west of us, have a zoning board of appeals. Those determinations go directly to their village board after their determination is made. In the city of Chicago, our neighbor to the south has a extensive staff review process, which goes from the zoning administrator to what would in Evanston is considered DAPR, before it goes to a public body for a public hearing and then goes to City Council. Only in Evanston is there the extra step of going to a City Council committee and then again to City Council. So what sparked this was some controversy about making certain special use permits, special orders of business, going to City Council. Some felt that that actually circumvented the process. When we review the City Code, there's nothing in the City Code that says the process is to go to the Planning and Development Committee. In fact, most of the City Code, with the exception of 2-19-4, which talks about the powers and duties of the Land Use Commission, talks about how the Land Use Commission, specifically in Chapter 6 of the Zoning Code, talks about how the items reviewed by the Land Use Commission, Land Use Commission makes a recommendation to the City Council. Also absent from the City Code is, if it does go to the Planning and Development Committee, what is the Planning and Development Committee supposed to do with it? What is its authority? Should that be the final determining body? And there was a discussion that was had about due process. So in considering all these options, due process was considered, and the due process that is afforded is to the applicant and those interested property owners. So interested property owners can be objectors within 500 feet, could be people within 1,000 feet, et cetera, depending upon how the code is written. So all of those things were considered in providing these options for discussion for the City Council. But what was most obviously missed was one of those options was to codify our current practice, which is to go to the Planning and Development Committee, because that is not in the City Code, and understand for staff what is the Planning and Development Committee's role once it gets this recommendation from the Land Use Commission. Is it simply to disagree with the Land Use Commission and then tell the City Council that we disagree? Is it to agree with the Land Use Commission and tell the City Council we agree? If the City Council is supposed to be the final determining body, then we need to actually clarify that in the City Code. Lastly, with regard to the suggestion that the Land Use Commission be the final determining body, we understand that staff understands it's not a necessarily popular choice. However, in an effort to not confuse things, City Council is a legislative body. Certainly, a lot of municipalities in the state of Illinois, City Council makes zoning decisions. But when we get to court, you're talking about a legislative decision as opposed to an administrative decision, and that's why the suggestion was made. Nevertheless, City Council can remain the final determining body. They are beholden to the public by a democratic process. Certainly welcome that. But we wanted to make sure that the City Council had all options on the table, and I wanted to, based upon media writings, public comments, et cetera, give the committee a little more background as to why these suggestions are what they are and why the Evanston process is somewhat unique from other communities, simply because we couldn't get enough people to participate in ZBA and Plan Commission.
Thank you. Alderman, Councilmember Hadakatis, and then Reed, and then Wynn.
I will just go on the record to say that I think Land Use Commission should not be the final determining body. I do feel, I had a discussion with Council Cummings earlier. A lot of the decisions we get coming to planning development require, some of them require 2/3 approval of council. Looking at the rules, and me personally, I would like Land Use Commission recommendations to come to full council so that we all have a voice in making that decision. I understand that some people like having it the intermediate step of being in planning and development, but considering that City Council is the final determining body, I would rather see it come to us directly. But if we decide planning development, that's fine too. I'm on that committee as well, so either way.
Councilmember Wynn.
Yes, I think I can't say fast enough that I think we should support option 3. The Planning and Development Committee, for the entire time I've been on the council, has played a really important role. And I thanks the Corporation Council for explaining to us what happened here. But I think that we should fix our ordinance and have it adhere to what our practice has been. That's all.
Councilmember Kelly.
Thank you. I would agree. I think it's very, very important that we have adequate, ample, and focused time just on plan developments and special uses, and that it's not just simply meshed into a very long city council meeting where we're dealing with budget and all kinds of other questions. It's very important that we retain the Planning and Development Committee's review of these items. And I also feel like this is covered, and I'm reading through 219.4, where it says over and over again that the Land Use Commission makes recommendations to the Planning and Development Committee. But so, again, I feel very strongly that we do need designated focus time for plan developments, for special uses, and the others listed here. I am amenable to looking at, if we want to, in the name of efficiency, of, if we need to skip or set aside maybe planning and development meets on a Monday when council doesn't, so that we have more time, or to maybe consolidate to fewer meetings. I don't know if that could work. I'd be open to discussing that as an option. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Kelly. Council Cummings.
Just one more thing I forgot. I mentioned the City of Chicago's process is very staff intensive. There also has been a referral, and I don't know the exact standing of it, to get rid of the Project and Review Committee. So to get rid of DAPR. So that would also be out of the mix. So there would just be the Zoning Administrator, Land Use Commission, and then whatever happens. As staff is looking for direction, if in fact the direction is to codify our current practice, we would also seek direction on what exactly happens at planning and development. And the reason why I asked that question is because it has come up to us. Well, we just had an example where the Planning and Development Committee voted 5-1 to reject a proposal. Does it die in that committee? Well, the way our code says right now, City Council is the final determining body. So it's almost like I don't want to say a wasted vote, because it does give us a preview as to how it's going to perform at City Council. But nevertheless, we would like some direction, because if we're going to amend the code, we might as well amend it to say what happens at committee.
Yeah. You answered the question I was about to ask. Like, can something die in P&D? And if that remains a question, my answer is yes. P&D is a committee of the council. And if something dies at P&D, then it dies. It does not have to die again at council. One death is enough. And yeah, I will just also go on the record as saying that, I want the city council or a committee of the city council to be the final determining body. We are the ones that are elected to make these decisions. We are the ones that are accountable to the public. And that the transparency of the conversation has to happen at the city council. And if the community doesn't like what the council decides, the community has a chance to vote for new council members. So I do want, I don't want to take the council out of this at all, although I am willing to allow the council to designate to a standing committee, in this case, the Planning and Development Committee, the responsibility for, being the first hearing of something. And if it dies there.
Well, the second, because the first is going to be the Land Use Commission.
From land use to P&D, then if it dies at P&D, it dies. If it passes P&D, then it goes to council. And I think has been our standard practice. That's what the community is comfortable with. And if there is a way to make the process more efficient and more timely by scheduling meetings on different nights, let's talk about that. But the object of democracy is not to have short meetings. If an efficient and effective democracy may have shorter meetings as kind of a byproduct of a good process, but that, shorter meetings and on-time starts are not in and of themselves the point of the whole process here. So,
and to that point, Councilmember Nuzma, this topic didn't necessarily come up for us to have shorter meetings per se, but so that the elected officials and city staff would not be in the building until 1 or 2 a.m. On the second and fourth Monday night of a month. City council rules, and along with that point, require planning and development to follow APW. So if the thought is to reschedule those meetings or have the city council rules need to be amended as well. So I just wanted to point that out.
I think that's probably the line of inquiry that makes the most sense to me. Yeah. Mayor Biss.
I just want to say, from my standpoint, option 2 is out of the question. What's important to me is that the full city council make the final determination, and I don't think I would not consider it acceptable for a subset of the council to make the final determination. I actually think it's really, really poor public policy to designate people who represent only a portion of the geographic whole to make decisions like this. So however it gets there, I would strongly advocate for the final decision being a vote of all 9.
And along those lines, under the current code, they're both recommendations. So the recommendation of the Land Use Commission, recommendation of the Planning and Development Committee, it can still maintain recommendations. And there may be times where the recommendation of the Planning and Development Committee doesn't match land use. Planning and Development can disagree with land use, and still it goes to City Council for the final determination. I'm just trying to make sure we get clear so that way when I go back.
A number of us have said something could die at P&D. Mayor Biss has expressed the opinion that it should not die at P&D. It would have to die again at council. Am I correctly stating?
No. I'm just expressing the opinion that we shouldn't delegate to P&D or anybody else besides all 9 council members the final determination. The final decision to approve something ought to be made by the full council.
To approve something.
Yeah.
Which is not the same as denying something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have strong feelings on anything else, frankly. Like, I could live with a variety of other options.
So what you just said was not in disagreement with those of us who said that something can die in P&D.
I'm relatively agnostic on that.
Reinforcing the point that the city council should be the final vote for approving something.
Yeah.
So this may be semantics, but the application is seeking approval universally. So if I, as a homeowner, developer, whatever, am seeking some sort of special use permit or unique use, and I submit this application, it's an application seeking approval, and if the final determining body is City Council for approval, it shouldn't die if the will of the body is for it to be approved by City Council. I just want to make sure that that's, from an interpretation standpoint, that's the way we've been reading the city code. So I just want to make sure it's clear, because I wrote it down in my notes that the mayor and Councilmember Harkars are on the same page, and then Wynn and Kelly are on the same page. So I just want to make sure I'm getting it clear.
Let me be extremely clear in saying that I'm not saying anything clear.
Okay.
I don't feel strongly on the question that it sounds like some other people do. So I'm not advocating against what council members Newsome and Wynn are suggesting. I'm just, the only thing I'm saying, I'm advocating against option 2 very strongly. And I'm advocating against what I thought now looks like wrongly that Councilmember Newsome was suggesting, which is that the city council could somehow say, like, hey man, we don't want to worry about these issues, we're too busy, so we're going to delegate all this authority to P&D. That's something I would not recommend. I want all 9 people to cast the final vote to say yes before something moves forward.
That may have been what the words out of my mouth said, but that is not what the ideas in my head were thinking. So just to clarify, I think where we all are here is that something goes from staff review to the Land Use Commission. Land Use Commission will vote on it and make a recommendation. Regardless of that vote, it goes to P&D. The matter is heard at P&D. And the matter is voted on at P&D. If it dies at P&D, it's dead. If it passes P&D, it goes to council for final approval.
I would recommend then that if that is the case.
Does that accurately reflect in everybody's understanding? Okay.
Then if that's the case, then that I would recommend at least codifying a threshold at P&D, because you could always, if you say no at P&D on a vote of 3-2, city council, all 9, could overturn that, but they don't get the chance because it died in committee. So what I'm suggesting is that you set a threshold in committee. Most recent example, something getting a 5-1 vote of no. Understanding you already have 5 votes at committee, you're likely going to get those same 5 votes at council completely comfortable. But if it's lower threshold than that, council could always say yes and disagree. But if they will never get the chance to, if it dies in committee by something less than a particular threshold.
Understood. Councilmember Hadakatis.
I'll hold off.
Councilmember Reed.
To the last point, I certainly, I think that everything should come to council at some point. I don't know if we need to set a threshold. Mine's, even on the last item, could have changed in between council. And I'm also envisioning a world where potentially the Planning and Development Committee is not on the same day right before council. I know that is our practice, but that practice could be changed at any point by us or by a future council. And if we're going to draft an ordinance that is far more permanent than our own desires for scheduling, I think we have to take that into account. And so I would encourage us to, I'm fine with an option that allows this. I'm fine with a practice that allows us to efficiently move through P&D and hear the public if they want to share public comment, and maybe have a practice of moving things to the full body, and then voting our conscience at the full body is not to set in place in an ordinance something that would limit a future council or create more confusion for a future council.
Councilmember Kelly, and then Councilmember Wynn.
Thank you. So I think precedent has worked relatively fine, and so I don't see any need to set thresholds or anything else. I think we continue as we have. I think the only thing that, to me, that really needs to be addressed is efficiency, so that we're not delaying the start of council by so much. So I would like to see us simply look at how to either consolidate into fewer meetings or perhaps look at a different evening. So, and again, I think it's already stated in our code, from what I'm reading, that, but I would say that we would continue as precedent has set over many, many years, that this continue to go to P&D. If it fails in P&D, it fails, period. Otherwise, to Mayor Biss's point, for final approval, it must go to council. Thank you.
I agree with Councilmember Kelly, but I also want to point out that there are any number of things that die at Human Services and ANPW that we don't, the full council doesn't get an opportunity to address. And I think that's the point of the standing committee system that we have had. I can't, thinking back, I think there was possibly only one development that I can think of that would have, my memory may be faulty, might have gone a different direction if it had not died at P&D. I think it was the tower, so, which was really controversial.
Council Cummings.
I was just going to point out to Councilmember Wynn's point that items die at other standing committees, perfectly acceptable. It's just that our code is written that city council does this with zoning. So like, that's the only reason why staff even brought this to the attention of the committee, is because the code says that council is supposed to be the final decision maker.
Noting that the consensus of this committee seems to be pretty solid here, we'll go to Councilmember Kelly, then Councilmember Reed.
So it seems like we would just need to add the words "for approval only" or something to that effect. I mean, it says it gets recommended. Okay, but the other point I just want to make, and then, is also, I think the way it currently stands when it goes to council, if it's been approved, is that does facilitate, it goes into the consent agenda. We understand that it's already been approved. Otherwise, it gets pulled off because and removed. But I think it's a relatively, currently an efficient system by having items move forward, only those that have been approved, and then put onto a consent agenda.
I would not anticipate staff coming forward with amendments to this like next week. I think I would have to talk to the Director of Community Development. This would most likely be part of the project to revamp the entire zoning code. But we would need to make sure that we would just continue understanding, we wouldn't continue with the practice of going through planning and development. And it would need to be sort of, we would need have the city council pass something that would say, like, if it dies at planning and development, it can die at planning and development. But I don't anticipate, like I said, I would have to collaborate with my colleague in community development to see like when any sort of legislation to try and change this process would come forward. I don't think it would come for Monday or anything like that.
Councilmember Reed.
Yeah, I just want to note to Councilmember Wynn's point, just to make sure this is in the way that we're thinking about this. Obviously, you're completely correct that many items die in committee. I just want to note that those items aren't applications from folks in our community. It's legislative actions rather than what this process is, which is almost quasi-judicial in some way. And so I just want to highlight that as a distinction here, and why it may make sense for the council to be the final arbiter rather than a committee.
Okay. If there's no further discussion, I'll make an attempt at kind of summarizing what we're saying here is don't do anything different. Land use to P&D, P&D to council if it passes P&D. If it doesn't pass P&D, it can die at P&D. And if we need to make changes to our city code to reflect that practice, then we need to do that. And so thank you to staff. Thank you to Council Cummings for bringing this problem to our attention to allow us to have this conversation and clarify the will of the council, the will of the Rules Committee. So with no further comments, no further discussion before this body, I will declare the meeting adjourned at 6:50 p.m. Thank you, everybody.